Possible new lead in the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie.
Oh, hopefully this is going to find her. I don't know. Dan Bowens, what do you know? Could it help crack the case?
Well, we hope.
There is a particular kind of silence that descends over a family when the truth has been circling the house for years. Not knocking, just waiting. Nancy Guthrie is 73 years old. She lives quietly now. The kind of quiet that looks like peace from the outside, but feels, to anyone paying close attention, more like the held breath before something finally gives. The kind of quiet that accumulates in rooms where too much has been left unsaid for too long. For more than 2 decades, she carried a story that the world believed it already knew. A grieving mother, a faith author, a woman whose double tragedy, losing not one child, but 2, became the foundation of a ministry, a brand, a carefully constructed public identity built entirely on the architecture of suffering well endured. People loved her for it. They needed her for it, but there was always something underneath. A seam in the story that didn't quite lie flat. Questions that polite audiences never thought to ask. Because when someone has lost that much, you don't press. You receive. You nod. You hold their book to your chest and feel grateful that someone has already put words to the grief you didn't know how to carry. And yet, the man who married into this family, the son-in-law who sat at those dinner tables, who watched the interviews from the side of the room, who knew what the cameras didn't, has finally spoken, not loudly, not dramatically, just one statement, measured and deliberate. But in families like this, one statement is enough to unravel everything. What did he actually say? And why now? After all this time, did he choose to say it at all? To understand why that statement matters, you have to understand what Nancy Guthrie built, not just the books, not just the speaking circuit, the image. Because in Christian publishing, in the world of grief memoirs and women's conferences and Sunday morning testimonials, image is infrastructure. It holds everything else up. Remove it, and nothing stands. Nancy entered public consciousness as a woman defined by an almost unbearable sequence of losses. Her daughter Hope lived 99 days before dying of Zellweger syndrome, a rare metabolic disorder that leaves no survivors. 6 months later, Nancy was pregnant again. Against medical advice, against the odds, against what most people would consider reasonable. And that child, too, was born with Zellweger. And that child, too, died. 2 babies. The same disease. The same outcome. Twice. The story was so extreme, so unflinching in its cruelty, that it almost collapsed under its own weight. And yet Nancy didn't collapse. She wrote holding on to hope. She stood at podiums. She looked into cameras with clear eyes and spoke about a God she claimed had been merciful in all of it. People wept. Publishers called. A ministry was born. For years, that narrative existed essentially unchallenged. The grief was real. No one questioned that. The faith was real. Or at least, it appeared to be. What people didn't examine closely enough was the gap between the private woman and the public figure. The space between what was felt and what was performed. Because in grief industries, and make no mistake, there is such an industry, the line between testimony and transaction blurs faster than anyone wants to admit. Faster than the person living it usually notices. The son-in-law understood this. He watched it up close, in real time, over years. His name has existed on the periphery of this story for a long time. Referenced occasionally, never centered. He was background. He was texture. He was the quiet man at the edge of the frame, while Nancy occupied the foreground with her soft voice and her certainty. But quiet men remember everything, and the statement he made recently, in a context that was not designed for spectacle, not designed for conflict, landed like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples are still moving outward, still touching things. What did that statement contain? What truth has been sitting dormant inside this family, waiting for someone with enough proximity and enough courage to finally name it? That is the story we're here to trace. Nancy Guthrie did not emerge from tragedy fully formed. She was someone before all of this. A person with ordinary ambitions and ordinary fears, and an ordinary life that gave no particular indication of what was coming. She grew up in a household where faith was furniture. Present, assumed, unremarkable. Not the hot, consuming kind that produces mystics. The steady kind. The kind that teaches you to endure without making too much noise about it. The kind that rewards composure and treats grief as something to be processed privately, gratefully, and then set aside. This matters more than it seems, because the children who are raised to endure quietly, who are taught that suffering is ennobling, that complaint is weakness, that the correct response to pain is a kind of gracious absorption. Those children become adults with a very specific kind of fracture running through them, invisible from the outside, felt only in moments of extraordinary pressure. They are capable of enormous resilience. They are also capable of burying things so deep that even they lose track of where the burial sites are. Nancy was intelligent, perceptive, the kind of woman who understood a room quickly, who knew how to make people feel seen without necessarily revealing much of herself. These are useful qualities in many professions. In the grief and faith industry, they are almost prerequisites. She married David Guthrie, built a life, had children, moved through the ordinary years with the ordinary accumulation of small joys and small disappointments that constitute most of a life. Most of the time, the years that no one makes documentaries about, the years that make you who you are. And then the diagnosis. Hope, 99 days. A funeral where people stood in rows not knowing what expression to wear, because what expression do you wear at a funeral for an infant? What do you say to a mother whose first daughter never learned to walk? The psychological event that followed was not simply grief. It was a reordering, a complete rearrangement of what Nancy understood herself to be and what she understood the world to be. The woman who had been quietly faithful was now publicly tested in a way that demanded a response. Not just an internal response, a visible one, because people were watching. People who had heard about hope, who had offered prayers, who now needed to see what Nancy Guthrie looked like on the other side of the UNSURV. IVABAE. She gave them an answer. And the answer she gave was, I am okay. God is good. This was not wasted. Whether she believed that completely in those early days is a question no one thought to ask, because it was what people needed. And once you give people what they need from your suffering, a kind of contract is formed, unwritten, unspoken, but binding. You have become the woman who survived with her faith intact. You cannot later revise the terms. The audience will not permit it. They have organized their own grief around yours. The book came out, and it moved. Not in the hushed, cautious way that difficult books sometimes move, finding their small audience and resting there. Holding on to hope found the wide current. Women's Bible studies, hospital gift shops, pastors who bought it in bulk to give to grieving families in their congregations. The kind of reach that happens when a book stops being a book and becomes a salve. Nancy Guthrie became a name, then a brand, then a kind of institution. The speaking invitations arrived, the conferences, the follow-up books, the study guides, a podcast eventually, because the world had moved on and Nancy moved with it, adapting her delivery without adapting her message. She was disciplined that way, consistent in a way that felt like integrity, and may well have been. She was good at this, genuinely good. The voice was warm and unhurried. The theology was careful without being cold. She did not perform her grief. Or if she did, she performed it so naturally that the distinction stopped mattering to anyone watching. Audiences sat in those conference center chairs and felt understood, felt accompanied, felt that their own private losses had been acknowledged by someone who had paid a higher price than most, and who had somehow, impossibly, come out the other side still standing. This is a real gift. It should not be dismissed simply because it also became lucrative. But here is where complexity enters. The second pregnancy, the second diagnosis, the second death, Gabriel, also born with Zellweger, also given a brief and agonizing window of life before the disease finished what it had started. Another 99-day wait in her arms. Another funeral. Another front row of people wearing the wrong expression. By this point, Nancy had already positioned herself. Had been positioned, really, by the response to the first book, as someone whose faith had survived catastrophic loss. The first death had been the credential. The second death was supposed to be the confirmation, the proof that the first response had been genuine and not performative. Because who performs grief twice? Who manufactures faith across two identical tragedies? The answer the public arrived at was no one. This woman is the real thing. But the son-in-law, watching from inside the family, not from the audience, saw something different. He saw what the conferences didn't see. He saw the cost that didn't appear in the author bio. The cost that doesn't appear in author bios because no one who controls the narrative has any interest in putting it there. He stayed quiet about it for a very long time. There is a version of Nancy Guthrie's story that ends with the second book, or the third book, or the podcast milestone. A clean narrative of tragedy transformed into purpose, pain transmuted into ministry, private tyranny redirected into public service. That helped thousands of people grieve their own undrivable losses. That version is not false. It is incomplete. The son-in-law married into a story that was already told before he arrived. His wife had grown up in the shadow of her siblings' deaths, in a household where grief had been transformed into a kind of vocation, where the calendar included not just ordinary family events, but speaking engagements and book deadlines, and the particular gravity of being a family that other people's pain was organized around, where the tragedy was never entirely in the past, because the past was the product. He loved his wife. He respected his mother-in-law. These things are not in dispute, but there were things he saw that didn't fit the narrative. Small things at first. The way certain conversations were redirected before they could land somewhere uncomfortable. The way certain questions went unanswered in private, even as they were answered with such fluency in public. The way the grief, which had been real and was still real, had also become, over time, something that required maintenance, something that had to be tended, curated, kept presentable, something that served a function beyond its original meaning. He didn't speak about any of this. Not for years. He carried it the way that sons-in-law carry things, as guests in someone else's story, uncertain of what they're permitted to say. What changed him was not a single dramatic event. It was accumulation. The slow, grinding pressure of watching something be used in ways that didn't entirely match what it was. The specific discomfort of sitting in an audience and hearing his family story told with a polish that smoothed over things he remembered being considerably rougher. The feeling, creeping, undeniable, that the version being told was curated in ways that protected certain things at the expense of certain people. And then there was the specific matter that prompted his recent statement, a matter involving questions about the Guthrie family that had begun circulating in the communities where Nancy's ministry operated. Questions about choices made, about financial arrangements, about the institutional apparatus that had grown up around her story and who it actually served. questions that the public Nancy had not addressed with the same fluency. She brought to everything else. He did not intend to speak publicly. He is not that kind of man, but the statement was made, quietly, in a context that was not designed for it, and it contained something the official narrative had never acknowledged. The first response was not silence. It was a particular kind of institutional quiet, the managed stillness of people who have been through reputation crises before and know that the first move is never the one you make in public. Within faith communities, this quiet has a specific texture. There is no press release, no rapid rebuttal. There is a series of private phone calls, each one careful and each one strategic. Pastors calling pastors, publishers calling agents. The machinery of reputation management engaging before most people even knew there was something to manage. Before most people had even processed what had been said. The statement itself was measured. He did not accuse. He did not dramatize. He simply said, in effect, that the version of events Nancy had presented publicly did not account for certain decisions that had consequences for people outside the frame of the story. That the ministry had been used, in specific instances, in ways that prioritized the narrative over the people the narrative was supposed to serve. This is the kind of statement that sounds almost bureaucratic until you sit with it long enough, until you understand what it means for a son-in-law to say it, until you understand what it costs a man, not a journalist, not a critic, not a stranger, but a man who shares Sunday dinners with this woman, to say clearly that the institution built around his mother-in-law's grief has not always been what it appeared. For Nancy, the impact was immediate and deeply complicated, because she had spent decades building one thing above all else: trust. The currency of her public life was authenticity, the idea that she, of all people, had nothing to hide. She had already given everything. She had already been stripped bare, publicly, twice. She had already shown the audience her worst. What could she possibly be protecting? That question is what made this statement so destabilizing. Not the specific content, the implication that there was something to protect, that the transparency had limits, that the woman who had written so movingly about surrender and release still held certain things very close and had been holding them for a very long time. The speaking invitations did not immediately dry up. They rarely do in the first weeks. The faith community is loyal and slow to withdraw. But the conversation shifted, online. In the careful way these conversations happen in religious spaces, where no one wants to be the first to say the hard thing directly. The gentle questions, the reluctant acknowledgments. People began, for the first time, to examine the story they had accepted, to notice the edges they had not examined before, and Nancy was quiet. In a way she had never been quiet before. Not the composed quiet of a woman who has found peace. The effortful quiet of a woman who is deciding what comes next. There is a theological tradition that speaks of the dark night of the soul, not as metaphor, but as a genuine spiritual passage. A period when the certainties that have sustained you simply stop sustaining. When the faith that has been your public identity becomes, in the private hours, a question rather than an answer. It would be presumptuous to say Nancy Guthrie entered such a passage. She has not said so herself, but something changed after the statement. Something slower and more interior than the public conversation, registered or could see, because here's the truth about building an identity around grief, a truth that no one writes about in the books sold at hospital gift shops. It works. Until it doesn't. Until the grief is old enough that you are no longer the woman who survived it. You are the woman who has been performing survival for 20 years. And at some point, the audience begins to wonder, quietly, privately, reluctantly, whether survival has become something else. Whether what looks like peace is actually a very convincing facsimile. Whether the woman speaking from the stage still has any genuine connection to the woman who actually lived through the thing she's describing, or whether the living and the describing separated so long ago that she can no longer tell the difference herself. These are not comfortable questions. They are the questions her son-in-law, in his careful and reluctant way, brought to the surface. Not to destroy her, not to expose her, but because the alternative, continued silence, had become its own kind of moral failure. The grief was real. The faith was real. The ministry helped real people who had nowhere else to turn. All of these things can be true at the same time as other things that are harder to say. The financial arrangements that were never fully examined. The family members whose experience of all this was not centered in the story the way it might have been. The living daughter, who grew up in the long shadow of the dead ones, whose grief was quieter because it was not the grief that sold books. The ways that institutions built around someone's tragedy can, over time, lose the thread of accountability so gradually that no one notices until the thread is gone entirely. She is 73 years old. She has buried 2 children. She has spent more than 2 decades in public service of a particular and costly kind. None of that disappears in light of one statement. But it cannot make that statement disappear either. What she is navigating now is something that has no guidebook, the particular challenge of the late life, reckoning. The moment when the story you've told about yourself for decades comes into direct contact with the full, unmanaged complexity of what actually happened. And you have to decide, at an age when reinvention feels almost impossible, whether to defend the story or revise it. Defending it is easier. She knows how to defend it. She has been doing it for 20 years. The language is available. The audience is sympathetic. The infrastructure of her reputation still stands, even if it has developed cracks. Revision is harder. Harder in ways that have nothing to do with public relations. Revision requires admitting to yourself, first and most painfully, that the frame was incomplete. That people organized their grief and their faith around a story that did not include everything it should have. That the transformation was real and also partial. That surviving tragedy, even double tragedy, even the unsurvivable, does not grant immunity from the ordinary, human failure to see how your survival affects the people who are standing closest to you. The ones not on the stage. There is a particular kind of silence that descends over a family when the truth has been circling the house for years. We said that at the beginning. We return to it now because it carries something different the second time. Nancy Guthrie, 73 years old. Living quietly. The conferences still come, less frequently. The books remain in print. The podcast continues its weekly rhythm. But the conversation around her has changed in a way that cannot be reversed, cannot be managed back to what it was. Because her son-in-law spoke. And what he said, measured, unhurried, without drama, introduced into the record a perspective that 20 years of careful narrative management had kept outside the frame.